and is a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts. And the title of her presentation is Nostalgia, Media and Populism. Sophie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. I've been asked to speak about nostalgia, media and populism, and there's quite a lot to get through on those three, but luckily they're all intrinsically linked. So I'm just going to firstly talk about nostalgia a little bit, and then move on to talking about populism, because of course the rise of nostalgia as a cultural and political force has told us a lot about the antecedents behind this populist movement and populist moment that we're in at the moment. So I'll speak a little bit about how populist leaders and parties are sort of harnessing the insecurities that are underpinning nostalgia, and then finally I'll just speak a little bit about the media and how changes within the media are increasing the visibility and prominence of populism in our public sphere. So I've been looking at nostalgia in a variety of different contexts, probably most prominently in a three-country study which I published last year, which was looking at the UK, I should say Great Britain, France and Germany. I'm also now looking at nostalgia in the United States and also in Ukraine. And these are all very distinct contexts, and it's important to note that while I undertake comparative research, as I'm sure Isabel would agree as well, there are some common threads that are weaving throughout the West and throughout Europe at the moment, but there's also very, very distinct national characteristics in play, not least of all related to the nature of their political systems, their historical context, cultural context, religious context, and so on. So it is important to emphasize that as well. But I am going to, for the sake of time, be speaking a rather blunt instrument with some of the key common findings across all of these types of research. And I think the first thing that probably bears emphasizing is why is it a problem? Why do we speak in a pejorative way about nostalgia and the past holding such currency, so to speak? Well, I think there's two key reasons, and the first is that we are really standing on the precipice of some really great looming challenges that we know lie in the horizon, and actually they're not too distant now. I mean, these forces of automation, climate change and so on, these are huge human level existential challenges, and not to mention demographic change and so on. So when our political systems are consumed with nostalgia, we are sucking all the oxygen away from being able to address the very real issues of inequality and so on that plague our societies today, but also really taking away the capacity to address these big looming challenges that lie on the horizon and are rapidly approaching. I think the second reason why nostalgia can be very dangerous is that it's often harnessed in a way to emphasize the reinstation of a kind of certain power structures and dynamics and social relationships of the past, which can be hugely detrimental to certain groups in society. So inevitably, it can be a kind of dog whistle in a way for a more exclusionary form of politics, and certainly a certain type of politics that can champion the reduction or abolition of sort of forces of empowerment and representation and rights that we have been affording to groups quite systematically, progressively over time. So there are just two reasons why I think nostalgia needs to be taken seriously in our politics. So looking across all of this research, I think it's quite clear that nostalgia has become quite endemic in our political cultures, to the extent now where many elections are actually being fought on competing visions of the past. And this was a British example of this was obviously the 2017 election, which was quite extraordinary in its nature, where you had the Conservative Party essentially proposing to reinstate certain circumstances and policies from really that had thought we'd moved long beyond, for example, grammar schools and fox hunting and so on. And then on the left you had Jeremy Corbyn kind of promoting a sort of 1970s economic model. So this is a very extraordinary time, but Britain is not unique in this. We've seen a lot of these kind of appeals in many elections. We saw this in the French election in 2017 as well, of course. And I think if we look at the data really if we collectivize all the opinion polling, it is clear that right across Europe and pretty much in every Western country actually at the moment, that the majorities in the population believe that life was better when they were growing up. Now, of course, nostalgia is a natural human condition, and this is why it's so powerful as a political tool, because we all actually naturally have a little kick that comes in. There's a lot of research on nostalgia in the framework of neuroscience and psychology, which makes this very clear. So it's something that we all feel, but there are different types of nostalgia and different kind of spheres of nostalgia, and there is a difference between a nostalgia which has been described as a kind of reflective nostalgia. This is the kind of benign rose-tinted glasses through which we look back at the past and everything feels simpler and happier, to the kind of dangerous form of nostalgia which is described as a restorative nostalgia, which is saying that we actually want to reinstate these conditions of the past. This sense of this appeal of nostalgia is being driven by a perception of decline. It's being felt at both a personal level and a national level. It's also being felt within the economy. It's being felt about social mobility, the nature of our politics, the nature of our discourse, our country's clout on the world stage, and I think most significantly as well within communities. That's the number one area in which people perceive decline, is within communities. And I think part of the reason that we are continuing to evoke these historical narratives and figures in our politics is because we don't seem to be able to conjure powerful news stories or securitizing stories about the future that are compelling to citizens. And this is a very critical point. The studying nostalgia is effectively cataloguing grievances with the present, but also fears about the future. And those two forces became very clear in the focus groups I have been doing on this subject. People feel very uneasy about what the new economic and social and political world order is going to be, how automation is going to affect their lives. In fact, the future feels a very foreign and distant and menacing concept to a lot of people. The only sense of certainty they have about it is that, and particularly when you're talking with people from low socioeconomic groups, is that they will be at the bottom of whatever new pecking order emerges out of this. And I think they're absolutely right to be fearful. They're also right to perceive that there will be a new social and economic and political settlement. So if we tell them that there's no reason to be afraid, you've got an uphill battle there, that there needs to be something substantive. So I think that there are many forces that are underpinning this sense of dissatisfaction and fear and so on, but I think change is a very important part of this. We often speak as there's a dichotomy between social and cultural aspects of this change or economic change. Particularly within academic communities, you will often see almost fights between the two different tribes who will champion one view or the other. Sometimes it's people on the right versus people on the left. Sometimes it's just different sort of strands within academia. But I think it's very dangerous to present them as a dichotomy. I think it's very clear that economic change has played a role. I don't think we can skim over that too easily. I think the forces of deindustrialization have obviously borne some incredibly important long-term consequences. That the sense of being a nation that makes things is actually, it turns out to be very important for people's psychology and sense of pride and having a stake in the way in which the economy works and their own contribution. It's also true that there have been quite significant ongoing effects of the global financial crisis, even in countries that seem to have sort of bounced back to some degree. We know that it has accelerated the labour market shifts into sort of more short-term, more precarious employment. We know that a lot of the precariousness that was previously felt by the working classes was expanded into the middle classes as a result of this. So I don't think we can entirely dismiss the economic argument, but so too the social and cultural argument. I mean, if we just want to look specifically at right-wing populist parties that are promoting nostalgic messages, I mean, these demographics are quite complex, but there are some consistencies in their views on a number of core issues. I'm sure we're all aware they generally tend to think that the country's in a state of decline, that immigration has been a negative thing for the country, that communities are being eroded, that national values and traditions are under threat, and so on. But it's also true that many of these opinions are starting to seep into the electorate as a whole. Actually, 55% of Brits think that successive governments have not done enough to uphold and promote British values. That obviously rises up to 80% when you're looking at Leave voters. But that is a majority position across the country. And I think that citizens just generally perceive that these sort of forces that once held us together are being displaced by a number of different things. They think that they've been poorly defended by governments who are sort of failing to actively defend and promote their nation's heritage. So I don't think it's a dichotomy. I think you only have to go into, for example, deindustrialized towns. I spent a lot of time there. You can see there is a story of economic displacement there, but you can also see that there is a huge degree of social displacement that's gone on. And the sense of the psychological impact of living in these places can be imbued into the younger generations, for example, where they're even adopting a sense of kind of imagined nostalgia about the past. What does it mean to live in a place that was once great? So I think we should see them as mutually reinforcing. So this is where populism all comes in, and if I think about focus groups I've done in so many different countries, actually what is very striking is that the conversations are often almost verbatim the same. So there are some very distinct similarities. There is a perception of loss which is activating a kind of a sense of a need to defend what is being lost. So this then of course cues the arrival of these very dynamic and effective leaders. They are very skilled political communicators. They have often very canny, savvy digital operations behind them. And I think these politicians, these parties, these campaigns are championing a kind of reassertion of systems and structures and power dynamics and identities and values and so on that we thought, or we might have thought, had been superseded. And they're capitalizing on these very real fissures that are developing in our societies, and they're exacerbating them, of course. But I think if for citizens who are very weary and wary of adaptation and who feel that they've been constantly asked to adapt, to change, I think that these populists are not only offering a sense of representation, but also a sense of liberation. They say, I see you and I validate you, and your feelings of resistance and discomfort are not wrong, but also you don't have to be like this anymore. I'm empowering you to forge a different path. So I think if I just skip through to the media, I think this is obviously a huge topic and warrants a conference in and of itself, but I think it is very important to look at the media and the changes within the media in the context of these other changes, because new media has utterly transformed traditional news organizations, and it's not just about the production of news itself, but also the content it's producing and the business model in which it's operating. It's evolved the role of being a journalist to an extraordinary degree. And one of the biggest impacts of all of these changes has been on the time and resources available for news production. Now, all of this is very important if we're thinking about nostalgia and we're thinking about populism, because the media is obviously such a critical pillar of our democratic institutions, and it is still this incredible mouthpiece and connective tissue and fibre between our elected representatives and citizens. So if there are really transformative changes going on in the media, which there are, we need to consider this as a democratic issue. I was doing some research which I published, I think at the start of last year, looking at the media and populism and how the media was responding to this new dynamic. And I think it is a really important point, because the populism fundamentally challenges the power structures, the traditional power structures that have underpinned the way in which media and politics operate in a kind of ecosystem. And critical to all of this is negative coverage, right? So because populists position themselves as anti-establishment, because the media is positioned as part of the establishment, if the media is then providing negative coverage towards them, then that is just grist to the mill, that is used as evidence of a kind of establishment conspiracy. And so I think that is incredibly challenging for media organizations, and many of them are very much on the back foot around that. Obviously, many populists are also incredibly sophisticated communicators through digital tools, so they can bypass the media altogether. We see Trump with his tweeting and so on. I did a little study as part of this, well, quite a big study actually, looking at how journalists covered the European referendum, and also how journalists covered the German elections in 2017. And there were some quite consistent lessons there, but just a couple of them is that journalists covering the campaign, the EU referendum, they didn't feel themselves adequately educated about the topics. There were huge challenges for the public broadcasters, who really struggled to interpret their remit and mandate for objectivity versus balance. These traditional media organizations were really struggling to adapt their traditional general election coverage techniques to a referendum environment that was very different. But I think so. All of that really was built on the foundations of the fact that news organizations are in a huge period of transition at the moment. Even if they didn't have populism to deal with, they would still be in a really reflective point of trying to understand how they maintain their relevance, efficacy, and effectiveness and standards in the digital media age. The fact that we have, tremendous social and demographic changes going on, huge degrees of economic dissatisfaction, political dissatisfaction, and a digital transformation all taking place at the same time, I think just highlights the fact that there's a tremendous challenge for our media organizations, there's a tremendous challenge for our political institutions, and that's because you have all of these forces coalescing at the same time in a kind of perfect storm. So where in the past we might have had to deal with one of these crises, we're now dealing with these kind of cumulative, interconnected crises which are all compounding one another. So I will just finish by saying I think we have to be very careful not to be complacent about what's happening at the moment, because certainly there is, and I can tell you from coming from Westminster, which is obviously the eye of the storm of all of this at the moment, there is a sense that we are in a period of crisis. Well, we are in a period of crisis. The problem with thinking that you're in a period of crisis is it can also provide a degree of complacency, because you think, well, we're in a crisis environment, so everything's extraordinary. And people aren't really reflecting about the fact that, we still have the architecture of liberal democracies at the moment. that everything that's happening now, everything that we're forging, everything that we do every day in our various roles within these democracies, we are actually shaping the course of our nations for tomorrow. And, we will wake up one day and this crisis period is over and we've actually changed the architecture. So I think we need to be very conscientious about this.